Welcome to the Economy Magazine at I-24 News, where we take a look at the most fascinating stories in global business and innovation. I'm Natalie Ehrlich. Well, coming up today, a look at the money and influence behind the U.S. gun industry. And power outages in the DRC threaten the mining sector. First, let's start with the headlines. Well, in yet another surprising twist in the last chapter of the Greek debt drama, the Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras on Wednesday said that some creditors hadn't accepted Athens' latest proposals. Optimism surged on Monday as he delivered a last-ditch package of measures showing new willingness to adopt pension reform. But ahead of meetings with Greece's creditors on Wednesday, Tsipras already signaled Greece was not in the clear, as some creditors apparently hadn't accepted the offer. Tsipras will now meet with the heads of the ECB, IMF, and European Commission on Wednesday evening, with hopes of striking a deal before Athens' bailout expires and some 1.5 billion euros in payments are due on June 30th. Well, before the view on Greece shifted on Wednesday, the Japanese markets were able to ride out that optimism just earlier in the day. The Nikkei stock average ended up 0.3% at 20,868.03, its highest level in 18 years. Japan shares have steadily climbed higher since October, thanks in part to buying by the government's pension fund, a weaker Japanese yen, and more interest from local investors. European grocery chains Royal Ahold and Delhaize Group have agreed to merge, set now to become one of the largest supermarket operators in the United States. The combined company would be worth some 26 billion euros based on their share prices on Tuesday's market close. The two firms are based in Europe. Both generate some 60% of their sales in the U.S. This new company, called Ahold Delhaize, will have more than 6,500 stores with 375,000 workers. The United States chided China on Tuesday over what it called state-sponsored cyber theft. The U.S. government suspects hackers in China breached U.S. government computers, stealing records of as many as 4 million people. During opening statements, China expressed interest in constructive relations, but U.S. Vice President Joe Biden said that the two sides might not be able to resolve their differences during these high-level meetings. The recent breach threatens economic ties, said to be worth $590 billion in the previous year. U.S. Treasury Secretary Jack Lew also expressed concern.
On cyberspace in particular, we remain deeply concerned about Chinese government-sponsored cyber-enabled theft of confidential business information and proprietary technology from U.S. companies. Such activity falls outside of the bounds of acceptable state behavior in cyberspace. A more open, secure, and interoperable and reliable cyberspace is critical to free and fair commerce, and we look forward to discussing these matters further.
Central banks in emerging markets are using up their foreign currency reserves at the fastest pace since 2009. According to the Wall Street Journal's analysis of IMF data, total foreign exchange reserves in emerging nations have declined somewhere between $222 billion to $7.5 trillion during the first quarter of 2015. Nearly half of that drop comes from China. The reserve drain confirms many of the stresses emerging economies currently face with sluggish growth and could get worse as the U.S. Federal Reserve looks ready to hike rates as soon as September. Well, in the wake of another public shooting in the U.S., this time in a church in South Carolina, reporter Daniel Roth now examines the power of the gun lobby in Washington.
Following the December 2012 Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Newtown, Connecticut, in which 27 were killed, including 20 children, President Barack Obama made a major push for gun control. Those efforts did not bear fruit, in part due to a powerful gun lobby. Now the issue has been brought to the fore again in the wake of an attack that killed 9 African-American churchgoers in Charleston, South Carolina, perpetrated by a white supremacist terrorist.
Mother Emanuel is, in fact, more than a church. This is a place of worship that was founded by African Americans seeking liberty. At some point, we as a country will have to reckon with the fact that this type of mass violence does not happen in other advanced countries. It doesn't happen in other places with this kind of frequency. And it is in our power to do something about it.
The firearms lobby in the U.S. is powerful. especially in comparison to their gun control counterparts. According to the Boston Globe, in 2013-14, the gun lobby, including the National Rifle Association and the National Shooting Sports Foundation, collectively spent around $30 million on lobbying and campaign contributions, with sums as large as $74,000 going to Republican House Speaker John Boehner. Meanwhile, pro-gun spending topped the gun control lobby by a 7-to-1 ratio, according to the report. It's a reality that many say impedes change on the federal level. Indeed, the president last week seemed resigned to a lack of political will for the time being.
I say that recognizing the politics in this town foreclose a lot of those avenues right now. But it'd be wrong for us not to acknowledge it. And at some point, it's going to be important for the American people to come to grips with it.
And the industry is growing, in part thanks to the friendly political environment and in part due to perception. Despite two-decade violent crime lows, 63% of Americans told Gallup they perceived a rise in crime. And the money is flowing in. Firearm manufacturing in the United States has doubled in size since the recession began in 2008, growing from a $19.1 billion industry to a $42.9 billion industry. At the same time, with more guns out there, gun ownership is at a 4-decade low, with only 32% of Americans owning guns, according to the General Social Survey. That means more guns in the hands of less people, and according to a seminal investigation by Mother Jones magazine, even as violent crime is going down, overall gun injury and deaths are going up. 750,000 Americans have been injured by gunshots over the last decade, and 320,000 have been killed, adding up, including direct and indirect costs, to an annual $229 billion.
There is one common denominator of all of the homicides, and that one common denominator is the gun.
While the gun debate rages atop the national discourse in the United States, most don't see change on the horizon, even in the wake of violence like the recent racially motivated terror attack in Charleston.
Well, now closer to home, Israel and Germany mark 50 years since the renewal of ties. For a look at the evolution of this unique friendship, we are joined in studio by Grisha Elroy, CEO of the Israeli-German Chamber of Industry and Commerce. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
In the wake of the Holocaust years, how did Israel and Germany manage to renew ties there as countries?
Well, first of all, it was very difficult in the beginning for either side, for both sides. Israelis didn't want to hear about Germany. They didn't want to purchase German goods, and they wouldn't want to hear German or to speak German. On the other hand, wisdom and realism had it that both countries had to find a way to renew ties, diplomatic ties, exactly 50 years from today back, but also economically, and that started even earlier than the beginning of the diplomatic ties.
Well, you mentioned that these German companies tried to downplay their German roots, in fact, upping the image of a European company. How did that go about? How did Israeli consumers respond to that in those years?
Well, first of all, Germany supplied Israel with investment goods already back in the 50s. Long before diplomatic relations. In the consumer goods fields, it is true that German goods were known as being qualitatively good and dependable, but on the other hand, Israelis wouldn't want to buy German goods. So German companies sold in Israel, started very slowly, very quietly, and they advertised those goods as being European or being Austrian or coming from Switzerland, or just not mentioning the country of origin, although the customers actually very well knew where Telefunken and Grundig and Miele and Bosch came from.
Indeed. Well, moving on that, how was the evolution? Now, Berlin is one of the most attractive cities for Israelis, especially young Israelis, and Germany is perhaps one of the most popular nations in the world, especially here in Israel as well. How did that evolution happen?
Well, we came a long way. These 5 decades were characterized by a growing dependency, interdependency, by lots of ties, civic ties, political ties. Germany became the third important trading partner to Israel after the United States and China. It is the most important one in Europe. It is a dependable friend of Israel in political times that are not so easy for Israel like nowadays. And especially German goods are interesting for Israelis, and what is more important in my view is that Israeli technology is interesting for German companies. More and more German companies, huge companies but also small and medium-sized companies, are taking interest in the startup nation Israel. And we are organizing, commemorating those 50 years, an exhibition next Monday and Tuesday here in Tel Aviv, where we want to show how German brands and German products entered the Israeli market in those 5 decades. And we are showing also what today is going on between both economies.
Well, thank you so much for coming into the studio. We do appreciate your insight very much.
Thank you.
Moving on now to an entirely different story. Power outages threaten the Democratic Republic of Congo's main economic engine, mining. Let's take a look.
Lubumbashi, the capital of the Democratic Republic of Congo's Katanga province, is the country's economic powerhouse. Much of the city's wealth comes from mining copper and cobalt. But chronic power shortages are threatening production.
We can't reach 1,500,000 tons of copper without energy. And to have energy, we must invest in whatever energy infrastructure there is. And we have to wait for these investments, or they won't be enough to ensure that level of production.
Power plants in the country are dilapidated and regularly taken out of service for maintenance checks. With the energy deficit for the mining sector in Katanga rated at 600 megawatts, the industry is crying out for new power plants to be built. But for now, the public electricity company SNEL is sticking to simply repairing the existing power plants instead.
With these rehabilitation efforts, we think that after 1 year, SNEL will be able to increase the installed power.
This privately owned factory extracts cobalt, copper and zinc oxide from a mountain of slag located outside the capital. It takes 34 megawatts of electricity to power the giant furnace to operate at full capacity. But DR Congo's national power company, SNEL, is only supplying 24 megawatts, and power cuts are common.
If the network switches off, the large oven also goes off, the induction furnace is also stopped, all production is stopped.
The ongoing power shortages mean miners have to install generators or import electricity from Zambia. For the Chinese company CDM, the lack of power forced them to cut 300 jobs.
We can't work with the little power we have. This is what forced us to shut down the 4 furnaces and lay off all those people working with us.
The problem is far from resolved. Although the government is eager to promote the further expansion of the mining sector, the country's energy sector remains fragile.
And now for the stories we just didn't want you to miss. We are joined on set by Daniel Roth. So what do you have for us today?
First things first, the Confederate flag. Of course, in the wake of the Charleston shooting, this terror attack in the South against that killed 9 African Americans, we saw an outpouring, people calling on the State House, on a public property in Charleston, to take down its Confederate flag, and this kind of spread very quickly, and as the New York Times article put it, very emotionally spread across the nation, and people started calling for Confederate flags to be everything from banned to burned, and just gotten rid of. Now, a little more of a tempered response from politicians saying it's time to take down the flag and put it in a museum, which is sort of their way of walking the line, I guess. But one of the things we're seeing is that businesses, huge businesses, Sears, Amazon, eBay, these and Walmart are taking their Confederate flags, which, yes, I know what you're thinking, there's in 2015 selling Confederate flags. They're taking
a sale. But it is shocking, as you say. It's
shocking when you think about what that stands for. It's a symbol for millions, tens of millions of people, hundreds of millions of people, really, of slavery, of oppression, and
this is a symbol of hate. I mean, could you compare this to the swastika
Yeah, I don't think that's a stretch at all. I think for millions of people, it's a symbol of oppression, of hate, of death, of murder. And it's a symbol that's been standing on public properties and is still on the Mississippi flag. But what we're seeing is companies are actually in just a few days are removing them from their stocks. They're taking them off Amazon. They're taking them off the shelves of Walmart. And they're saying is, kind of this immediate response. Now, one of the things that's important to note is getting rid of the Confederate flag is not equivalent to ending racism in America. Racism is still a major problem. We saw, this murder is a prime example of that. The flag is a symbol, and it's as a symbolic move, it's important to be removing these flags from public spaces and for businesses to be feeling the pressure to take them off their shelves. But it's not the final answer to how to end racism.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that up, and it is very interesting to see the business community's response to these kind of events, if indeed it is a PR stunt or just a liability that they're trying to avoid. Well, that does wrap up our coverage today. Do stay tuned for all the latest in global business and innovation tomorrow from the Jaffa Port in Tel Aviv. I'm Natalie Orlick. Thank you.